Dileia Marsh had 10 minutes left on her lunch break when the black limousine tore off the overpass and crashed like a bullet into the street below. She was an electrical line worker, a widow, a single mother with an empty wallet, unpaid bills on the kitchen table, and no reason to risk her life for strangers. She should have stayed back like everyone else. She should have listened when the armed bodyguard shouted for the crowd to move away. But through the shattered glass, Dileia saw an elderly woman trapped inside, fading fast. So she ran toward the wreck. She killed the live current sparking across the pavement, forced open the crushed door, and dragged the woman out while the limousine groaned and slid closer to the edge of the drop. Dileia thought she had saved one stranger on an ordinary workday. She had no idea the woman in that car belonged to the most dangerous family in the city. And one day, the entire underworld would remember the poor widow who ran toward death when everyone else stepped back. She had just saved the grandmother of the most feared crime boss in Holloway City. Now, the company wants to fire her, and that man has just made a decision. This woman's courage deserves to be repaid, and whoever staged that so-called accident will pay dearly for it. What Dileia didn't know yet was that she had just walked straight into the heart of a war she never chose. If Dileia's story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still here, still watching, and still walking beside us. Don't forget to share this video with the people who need to be reminded that kindness has never been meaningless. And please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next deeply emotional stories waiting ahead. But to understand how this dark storm began, we must look back to the chaotic moments right after the crash. Minutes earlier, the older woman lay on the concrete floor, her chest rising and falling faintly but steadily, and that was all Dileia needed to see to know she had won the race against death. The wail of sirens tore through the noon air as the ambulance pulled up, and then a team of paramedics rushed out with a stretcher and equipment, pushing Dileia back with the practiced movements of people who had done this too many times to count. She stepped back a few paces, both hands hanging loose at her sides, and only then did she realize they were trembling violently. Thin cuts across the backs of her hands were leaking tiny drops of blood, dark red against skin smeared with road dust. But she could hardly feel the pain. Adrenaline was still roaring through her veins, making every sound around her seem as if it were echoing up from the bottom of a deep well. She watched the medical team place an oxygen mask over the old woman's pale face, heard them call out a few numbers, then saw them lift the stretcher, and that fragile body drifted into the belly of the ambulance like a leaf carried away by the current. The doors slammed, shut. The siren screamed again, fading into the distance, then dissolving into the chaotic pulse of the city. Around her, the crowd still hadn't scattered. Dozens of phones were raised, their lenses aimed at her like soulless eyes, recording every movement, every ragged breath of the woman who had just done what no one else had dared to do. There were whispers. Someone called her a hero. Someone else pointed toward the limousine lying tilted beside the edge of the overpass, its shattered glass glittering beneath the sun. Dileia couldn't hear anything clearly. She stood there in the middle of all that noise, feeling as lost as a small island in the open sea. The two bodyguards still hadn't left. They stood a few steps away from her, their shoulders as broad as cabinet doors, their faces hard and unreadable. The taller one raised a hand to his ear, listening to something through the hidden earpiece, then turned to look at her with a gaze she couldn't understand. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't anger, either. It was something caught between two cliffs, something that looked both like caution and like a warning. He stepped closer, lowering his voice until only she could hear him over the noise. "You've just pulled your whole life onto a different road, and you don't even understand it yet," he said, each word dropping like a cold stone. "The woman you just saved isn't an ordinary old lady. You'll know soon enough, sooner than you think." Dileia opened her mouth, wanting to demand an explanation, but he had already turned away, striding in the direction where the ambulance had disappeared, taking his companion with him, and leaving her alone with that sentence hanging inside her mind like a dark storm cloud. She watched until their broad backs disappeared into the crowd, then lowered her gaze to her bloodied hands. His words were still echoing, planting in her chest a restless feeling she couldn't name, as if she had accidentally opened a door that should have been left untouched. A security guard from the complex ran over to ask if she was all right. Handing her a piece of gauze while stammering something about calling first aid, Dileia shook her head and said she was fine, that she only needed to get back to work. She quickly wiped her hands on the legs of her work pants, drew in a deep breath, and forced herself to walk as though nothing had happened. But that uneasy instinct kept clinging to her, heavy on her shoulders like the tool bag she carried every day. Her shift still wasn't over. There were still wires to inspect, still electrical panels waiting for her hands, still a little daughter waiting at home for her to return with a modest dinner. Life had never allowed a woman like her to stop for too long and think. And yet, as she walked back toward the work area, slipping through the crowd that was still murmuring about what had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that this noon hour had split her life cleanly in two. One half made of everything she had ever known, and the other made of something waiting ahead of her, dark and mysterious, something she had no way of seeing through. Less than 2 hours after the ambulance drove away, Dileia's phone vibrated with a brief message from Human Resources, ordering her to come immediately to the top floor of the Brightline Power Building. She knew that couldn't mean anything good. When she stepped through the glass door of the chief operating officer's office, the air inside was so cold she almost shivered. Gerald Ashworth sat behind a vast desk, his hands folded together on the polished wood, while Tom Regan, her direct supervisor, stood off to one side with the expression of a man who didn't want to be involved, but had no choice except to be there. Without bothering to look up, Ashworth pointed to the empty chair in front of him, his voice flat and mechanical. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've just caused?" he asked, and only then did he lift his eyes to her with a sharp, cold stare. Dileia sat down, her back straight, her bandaged hands resting neatly on her lap. She answered that she had saved a human life, that if she had been even 1 minute slower, that woman wouldn't have had another chance. Ashworth let out a dry laugh with no warmth in it at all. He said she had abandoned her assigned post during working hours, that she had destroyed third-party property without authorization, that she had interfered with a scene that should have been left to specialized personnel, and that all of those reckless actions could expose the company to lawsuits worth millions of dollars. Reen mumbled that safety procedures existed for a reason, that a good employee was an employee who knew how to comply. Dileia felt heat surge up into her temples. She asked, her voice not loud but as steady as steel, whether they truly wanted her to stand there with her arms folded and watch a human being stop breathing right in front of her just because of a line of rules written on paper. She said she was an electrician, that she had been trained to act when lives were in danger, and that the exposed current on the road at that moment had been dangerous for the whole crowd, not only for the person inside the car. For one brief moment, she caught something strange. When she mentioned the car and the accident scene, Ashworth's fingers suddenly tightened, the backs of his hands turning white, and his eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second before he could hide it. He swallowed hard, shifting in his chair as if the expensive leather seat had suddenly become too small, then quickly turned the conversation back to disciplinary action, his voice much more hurried than it had been at first. Dileia didn't fully understand the meaning of that moment, but it was enough to carve a faint question mark into her mind, a feeling that this man was afraid of something far bigger than broken glass and the lawsuits he had just been preaching about. He announced that from this moment on she was suspended without pay until a formal disciplinary hearing decided her fate, and that in all likelihood her contract would be terminated permanently. Dileia felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. She thought of the stack of bills on the kitchen table, of next month's rent, of her little daughter's face each night as she looked up and asked if Mommy was tired today. She opened her mouth, about to protest one more time, but Ashworth raised his hand to stop her, saying the conversation was over, and that she should consider herself lucky the company was giving her a hearing instead of throwing her out immediately. Regan avoided her eyes, lowering his gaze to the file in his hands as though there were something more interesting inside it than the fate of a human being. Dileia stood, her legs trembling slightly, though she forced her back to remain straight, and walked out of that cold room with the feeling that she had just been condemned for the kindest thing she had ever done in her life. The glass door closed behind her, and in the final instant, before it shut completely, she still managed to glance back and see Ashworth lifting the phone, his hand still trembling, his face drained of every last drop of blood. Dusk had already begun to settle when Dileia stepped down from the last bus and dragged herself back toward the boarding house, hidden behind a row of aging warehouses on the southern edge of Holloway City, where the rent was cheap enough that people paid for it with paper-thin walls and the groaning of freight trains all through the night. She had just slipped her key into the lock when the door flew open from inside, and a tiny body rushed straight into her legs with a cry of joy that melted away every bit of exhaustion from that endless day. "Mommy's home," Posey shouted, wrapping her little arms tightly around her mother's thigh, her messy curls tilted upward, her smile showing the gap where a front tooth had just fallen out. Dileia sank to her knees, gathered the child into her arms, breathed in the faint smell of children's bath soap in her hair, and in that moment, She felt richer than any of the people living inside the skyscrapers beyond those streets. Mrs. Hester, the elderly neighbor who still watched Posey for her in the afternoons, smiled from the doorway and quietly withdrew, leaving mother and daughter alone in the small room that had just enough space for one bed, one wobbly dining table, and a tiny kitchen corner. Posey chattered on about the picture she had drawn at school, about the butterfly that had landed on the windowsill, about how she had tied her own shoelaces without anyone's help, and Dileia listened to every word with all the attention she had left, nodding, laughing, pretending to be amazed at exactly the right moments. While burying the fear that was twisting painfully inside her stomach, she reheated the pot of soup left over from the day before, broke a piece of bread in half, and watched the little girl eat hungrily with such delight that it seemed like the finest feast in the world. Only after Posey had fallen deeply asleep, her breathing steady beneath the thin blanket, did Dileia allow herself to collapse into the chair beside the dining table and bury her face in her bandaged hands. The weak yellow light fell across the small photograph on the shelf, a picture of her and a gentle, smiling man standing in front of a construction site, and her heart ached again with that familiar emptiness. It had been 2 years since that fateful morning, the morning Caleb, her husband, had put on his protective gear and kissed her forehead before leaving home, just like he did every other day. He was a scaffolding worker employed by a large contractor that was always preaching about safety, while cutting every possible dollar from cheap protective equipment. And on the day the scaffolding collapsed because of rusted bolts people had been warned about for a long time but had chosen to ignore, he was gone, leaving her alone with a small child and a mountain of debt from funeral costs and months without income. That company had paid her a pitiful settlement and then washed its hands of her, and understood better than anyone the price of negligence dressed up in the costume of rules written on paper. She quickly wiped the corner of her eye, refusing to let herself cry any longer because tears had never paid a single bill. Just then, her phone vibrated, and the name glowing on the screen made her heart tighten. On the other end came the cold voice of the man representing the loan she had been trying to hold off for months, reminding her that the final deadline was drawing near, and that if she couldn't pull together the full amount within the next few weeks, they would be forced to seize whatever she had left, including this tiny home. Dileia gripped the phone tightly, glanced toward her sleeping daughter, and answered in a voice she fought to keep calm, saying she would find a way, even though inside she no longer knew where there was anything left to hold on to. When the call ended, she sat motionless in the darkness for a long time, listening to the freight train groaning outside, and for the first time in many years, she felt the weight of life beginning to crush her shoulders. Across the city, in a room on the top floor of a glass tower overlooking all of Holloway City, as its lights began to come alive, Roderick Vance stood silently by the window with a glass of liquor he hadn't once brought to his lips when his phone rang. He was the man whose name the entire underworld knew but few dared to say aloud. The man who held the docks, the construction sites, and the hidden networks that no official dared touch. And he ruled his empire with silence far more often than with a roar. When the trembling voice on the other end reported that his grandmother had just been taken to the hospital in critical condition after a car accident, Rodri didn't raise his voice. He didn't smash anything. He didn't allow a single muscle in his face to betray him. He only set the glass down on the table with quiet care, remained silent for exactly 3 breaths, then gave a command so brief and cold it chilled the room, ordering his men to lock down the entire hospital corridor, bring the best doctor in the city there before the night was over, and let no one near his grandmother's room unless they had first passed through his people. With that one sentence, the massive machine behind him immediately began to move. Black cars rolled out of alleys. Phone calls were made. Doors that had once stayed shut suddenly opened before the Vance name as if it were a master key. His calm was more frightening than any rage could have been, because everyone who had ever worked under him understood that the quieter Roderick Vance became, the more violent the storm behind him would be. Margaret was the only person left in this world who could still make his hardened heart tremble, and the thought of her lying there, fragile on the line between life and death, stirred something inside him that he had buried a very long time ago. He arrived at the hospital before dawn, stood silently beside the bed, and looked at the pale face of the woman who had raised him, then left with a cold and merciless resolve. Back at his office, he ordered his people to gather everything connected to the accident: traffic camera footage, witness statements, diagrams of the scene, and he sat beneath the dim light, watching it again and again in silence. At first, everything looked like an ordinary accident, a car losing control and veering off the overpass, but the more he watched, the more a restless discomfort grew inside him, like a loose thread catching against his finger. Her private driver was a man who had served his family for many years. A man so careful he was almost rigid, and yet somehow he had let the car surge forward at an unreasonable speed, right at a curve he had driven through hundreds of times. Roderick rewound the footage, froze the image at the moment the car first began to drift off course, and narrowed his eyes when he noticed the strange way the vehicle swayed, not like a loss of control caused by carelessness, but as though something had already interfered with it before that moment. He didn't rush to a conclusion, because he was a man who had lived too long in a world where haste could cost a life. But his instinct, that same instinct that had kept him alive through so many years among wolves, was roaring that something was wrong beneath the surface of this so-called accident. He called the most trusted man in his inner circle, and ordered him to dig into every detail, inspect the car again, trace the driver's schedule in the days before the crash, and overlook nothing, no matter how small. Then he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the frozen frame glowing on the screen, and in the darkness of that room of power, a cold question began to take shape inside his mind, even though he still hadn't allowed himself to give it a name. 2 days later, when the morning sunlight slipped through the white curtains of the most luxurious hospital room money could buy, Margaret Vance slowly opened her eyes, and the first person she saw was her grandson sitting beside the bed, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. Roderick leaned forward the moment he saw her move, taking her thin hand in his, and for the first time in many years, his voice, usually as cold as ice, trembled softly when he called her name. Margaret smiled weakly, the wrinkles on her face easing, and whispered that she was still here, that her fate hadn't been meant to end on that day. She slowly told him about the only thing she could still remember clearly through the haze. Not the noise, not the impact, but a hand. She said that when she thought she had reached the final threshold, when everything around her had faded into a cold gray, someone had refused to let her go, a woman with strong hands and a determined voice that kept calling her back, kept pulling her out of that darkness as if she were wrestling her away from death itself. She said she hadn't been able to see that woman's face clearly, but she had felt the grit radiating from her, a kind of courage without decoration, without calculation, the courage of someone willing to run straight into danger simply because she couldn't stand by and watch another person die. Margaret tightened her hold on her grandson's hand, her eyes shining with a light Rodri hadn't seen in a long time, and she said that in her lifetime she had met plenty of powerful people who were ready to turn their backs on the vulnerable. But that woman was different. That woman had a quality money could never buy. She spoke again of the time when she was young, when she had poured her whole heart into creating a small fund to help poor workers injured on the job, people the system had abandoned, and she said the woman who had saved her was the living embodiment of everything she had once believed in, proof that kindness still existed somewhere in this cold city. Rodri listened to every word in silence, and a strange feeling rose inside his chest, both a gratitude so deep it almost hurt, and a gnawing guilt at the thought that this unknown woman had done what even the men he paid handsomely to protect Margaret had failed to do. He promised her that all she needed to do was rest, that everything else would be handled by him. And when he stepped out of the hospital room, his face had returned to its familiar coldness, but in his eyes there now burned a new flame of resolve. He immediately called his most trusted man, and ordered him in a voice that allowed no delay to find the identity of the woman who had saved his grandmother, to learn her name, who she was, where she lived, and what she did to survive. More important than anything, he said. Absolutely nothing unfortunate was to happen to her before he found her. The man on the other end asked what he intended to do once he found her, and Rodri stood still beside the window, looking down at the city curling beneath the morning mist, then answered quietly that some debts in this life couldn't be measured in money, and this was a debt he would repay with his own honor, even if he had to turn the whole city upside down to do it. 3 days later, Rodri's trusted man walked into the office with a thick file and a heavy expression that warned him what he was about to say would change everything. He set the documents down on the desk, opened them in front of Rodri, and began laying out what his team had dug up through sleepless nights. Margaret's car had been examined by a technical expert, and the conclusion made the entire room seem to freeze because its brake system had been tampered with in a sophisticated way. It wasn't a natural malfunction. It was the work of a hand that knew exactly what it was doing, a calculated method designed to make the car lose control at that deadly curve. This was no longer a vague instinct. It was the naked truth laid bare before him, that the day should have been his grandmother's last, and that someone had wanted it to happen. Rodri sat motionless, his fingers locked tightly together, his face revealing no emotion at all, but his eyes darkened like the sea before a storm. His trusted man turned to the next page and spoke the name Rodri had secretly feared for a long time. Silas Crow, the head of an underworld force that was expanding more and more across the western side of the city, an old and ambitious wolf who had repeatedly coveted the docks and networks controlled by the Vance family. Crow knew that attacking Rodri directly was impossible, so he had chosen the most cowardly way, aiming at his only weakness, the person he loved most in the world, to send a cold warning that nothing was untouchable, that even the strongest walls around him could be pierced. If everything had gone according to his plan, Margaret would have died in an accident no one questioned, and Rodri would have drowned in grief without ever knowing the truth. But that perfect plan had collapsed because of one variable Crow couldn't possibly have foreseen. An electrician who happened to be there at the exact fateful moment. A woman who hadn't been part of any of his calculations, who rushed in and stole back the life he had already decided to take. Dileia's accidental appearance had shattered the entire plot, turning a clean assassination into a humiliating failure, and unknowingly pushing her into becoming a living witness to the crime Crow wanted buried forever. But that still wasn't what sent a chill down Rodri's spine. His trusted man lowered his voice, his eyes briefly hesitating before he said the final thing, that in order to know Margaret's exact travel schedule that day, to know which route she would take, and at exactly what time, the mastermind must have had eyes and ears planted inside the closest ranks of the Vance family itself, because that information had never left the small circle of people Rodri trusted completely. The sentence hung in the air like a blade, and Rodri slowly lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the walls of the room of power he had believed to be safest. Realizing that the enemy wasn't only out there, but was hiding inside his own house, wearing the mask of a loyal man, he rose, walked to the window, looked down at the city stretching beneath his feet, and in that absolute silence, he understood that the war ahead wouldn't only be a war against Silas Crow. It would also be a painful cleansing within the heart of his own empire. He ordered his trusted man to keep everything they had just discovered completely secret, not to reveal it to anyone, while quietly tightening the circle of protection around the woman who had saved his grandmother, because now he understood that once Crow learned Dileia was still alive and could become a threat, he wouldn't leave her alone, and Rodri absolutely wouldn't allow one more innocent person to pay the price for his enemy's cruelty. That afternoon, just as Dileia stepped out of the unemployment benefits office with a stack of meaningless papers in her hand and a despair hanging heavy inside her chest, she noticed a glossy black car parked at the curb, and a tall man in a dark suit leaning against its door, watching her with a gaze that made her stop halfway through a step. He didn't need to introduce himself because the way the air around him seemed to sink, the way two other men stood several paces away with guarded postures, all of it said plainly that this was no ordinary man. He came closer, each step slow and deliberate, then spoke in a low, steady voice, so cold it sent a chill through her, saying he was Rodri Vance, and that the woman whose life she had saved on that fateful day was his grandmother. Dileia tightened her grip on the papers in her hand, her weary instinct rising inside her like an animal catching the scent of danger, and she answered that she had only done what anyone with a conscience would have done, that she didn't need anyone coming all the way here to remind her of it. Rodri tilted his head slightly, a brief trace of interest passing through his cold eyes, and he said she was wrong, because most people in this world would have chosen to stand still and look away, and what she had done that day was far rarer than she imagined. He said he hadn't come here just to offer empty thanks, but to ask for the chance to repay her, that he had the power to wipe away every trouble weighing on her shoulders, pay off all her debts, provide her daughter with a future she had never dared to dream of, and make certain no one would ever dare touch her again. An offer like that should have made her rejoice, but instead, Dileia felt only a vague fear rising inside her, a deep caution warning her that no gift in this life was free, especially not from a man who gave off such a shadowed kind of power. She stepped back, lifted her head, and answered that she had seen more than enough glittering promises in her life to know they always came with a price, that she didn't know who he was in this city, but she didn't want to be involved, didn't want to owe anyone anything, because once a person was in debt, they were no longer free. Roderick watched her in silence for a long while, and instead of growing angry at such a blunt refusal, he felt a strange respect rising inside him, because it had been a very long time since anyone had dared stand before him and turn him down with eyes that didn't tremble. He said he understood her caution, but he also warned her that she was standing in the middle of a situation far more dangerous than she realized. That the day she rushed in to save his grandmother, she had unknowingly stepped into a world she knew nothing about, and that whether she wanted it or not, certain people had already set their eyes on her. Dileia felt a chill crawl down her spine as she remembered the cryptic words from that bodyguard back then. But she still forced herself to hold her ground, answering that she could take care of herself and her daughter just as she had always done all these years, and that she didn't need any savior at all. Rodri only gave a faint nod, and didn't argue further. But before he turned away, he drew a simple card from his coat pocket, printed with nothing but a string of numbers, placed it in her hand, and said in a low, rough voice that when she realized she needed help and she would realize it soon enough, all she had to do was call that number. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of the sidewalk with the cold card in her hand and the instinctive feeling that her life had once again been pulled off its old course. The disciplinary hearing was only a few days away, and Dileia knew that if she didn't find a way to protect herself, she would lose everything. So, she decided to do the one thing her stubborn nature had always urged her to do: dig for the truth herself. An old coworker who still had a little sympathy for her secretly sent her a copy of the footage the company intended to present at the hearing. The video that was supposed to serve as evidence that she had recklessly destroyed property and abandoned her post. And when Dileia sat in her cramped boarding house room and opened that footage on the screen of her aging computer, the blood in her body seemed to freeze with outrage. The video had been skillfully cut. It began at the exact moment she swung her tool against the limousine door. But it completely removed the moments before that. The moments when she had seen exposed electrical current spitting sparks across the road. The moments when she had shut off the dangerous power that could have killed the entire crowd. The moments when she had seen a life fading behind the glass. They had carefully carved away all the context to turn an act of rescue into an act of mad destruction. To turn a hero into a reckless, undisciplined employee. Dileia rewound and replayed the footage dozens of times, and the more she watched, the more she realized something that made her heart go cold. This couldn't have been a random edit or an accidental technical error. It was deliberate manipulation carried out by someone with access to the company's camera system and a reason to want her condemned. In her mind, the image of Gerald Ashworth suddenly returned, sitting in that cold room. The way his fingers had tightened until they turned white when she mentioned the car in the scene. The way his eyes had shifted away and his voice had suddenly become hurried. The way he had rushed to pick up the phone with a trembling hand the moment she walked out the door. At the time, she hadn't understood, but now every piece was beginning to fit together in a terrifying way. She remembered that the substation near the curve where the car had gone over had been deteriorating for a long time, that there had been complaints about the aging, wiring, and rotten insulation in that area, warnings the company's leadership, headed by Ashworth, had ignored for months in order to save money. If the truth about the exposed current that day came to light, if people learned that the company's own negligence had helped create a deadly, dangerous scene, Ashworth would be the first one forced to bear responsibility, and his career would vanish like smoke. And so, he had chosen to silence the truth by twisting it, placing all the blame on the electrician who had been brave enough to act, turning her into a scapegoat to hide his own carelessness. An even more frightening thought passed through Dileia's mind, that perhaps Ashworth wasn't merely hiding his own negligence, that his excessive panic seemed to contain some larger fear, as if he were terrified of some invisible force standing behind him, though she still couldn't imagine what it was. She didn't have time to sink into vague suspicion, because she knew the original footage, the uncut video that still held the entire truth, had to exist somewhere in the company's storage system, and if she found it, she would have the weapon she needed to clear her name. Dileia clenched her fist, her eyes shining with the iron resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and she began following every clue, reaching out again to the coworkers who still believed in her, quietly asking about where the original data was stored, moving one silent step at a time closer to the Pulipasons, truth someone had desperately tried to bury. The deeper Dia dug in her search for the original video, the more she felt as if she were stirring up something far darker than she had imagined, and the feeling of being watched clung to her for days, as though some invisible pair of eyes was following every step she took. Then one evening, after she had just coaxed Posey to sleep and was sitting beneath the weak yellow light, reviewing the pile of clues again, her phone vibrated with a message from an unfamiliar number. She opened it, and her whole body seemed to turn to stone. The message didn't threaten her with crude words. It was even crueler than that because it only mentioned the name of the preschool Posey attended, along with the exact time the little girl was dismissed from class, and one cold sentence saying that some secrets were best left buried if she still wanted her daughter's afternoons to remain peaceful forever. There wasn't a single direct threat, not one violent word. But that deadly calm was exactly what made it terrifying, because it showed her that whoever stood behind it knew her most fragile weakness, knew the only thing in this world she would never dare to gamble with. Dileia's heart hammered wildly inside her chest. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and a primitive fear, the fear of a mother whose small child had been threatened, surged up and drowned every clear thought inside her. She rushed to the bed, looked down at Posey's angelic face as she slept, listened to the child's steady, innocent breathing, and tears spilled from her eyes before she could hold them back, because her little girl knew nothing about the dark world waiting outside. Still smiling in her dreams at a world where everything was good, Dileia sat there for a long time, torn apart between terror and helplessness, not knowing whom she could ask for help because she knew the police would only write up a report and leave it there, that they couldn't guard her child every hour of every day, and that a poor woman like her didn't have the strength to stand against an invisible force powerful enough to track even a child's school schedule. And then, in that moment of utter despair, her eyes stopped on the simple card printed with nothing but a string of numbers, the card she had thrown into a drawer and tried to forget, and Roderick Vance's low, rough words came echoing back through her mind, telling her to call when she realized she needed help. She had sworn to herself that she would never get involved in his world, that she would never owe a man like him anything. But now, with her daughter's life placed on the scale, all her principles and all her pride became small. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and dialed that number. And after only 2 rings, that familiar, calm, deep voice sounded on the other end. Dileia tried to speak, but her voice broke apart. She stammered through the message, the school, the fear that was choking her chest, and Rodri listened in absolute silence without interrupting her once. When she finished, he answered with only one sentence: that her daughter would be safe, that he promised her that, and there was such cold certainty in his voice that she believed him at once without needing another word of explanation. Less than half an hour later, she looked through the gap in the window and saw a car quietly parked at the corner of the street. 2 calm, watchful figures sitting inside. A silent presence, she understood, would from that moment on always be watching to protect her child. The next morning, when she took Posey to school, the little girl still held her mother's hand and skipped along, chattering without a care, completely unaware that strangers were quietly guarding her peace. And for the first time in days, Dileia felt that the line between her world and Rodri Vance's world had been erased forever. On the morning of the disciplinary hearing, Dileia walked into the large conference room at Brightline Power with her back straight and a small hard drive hidden inside her coat pocket, the weapon she had paid for with countless sleepless nights. Seated behind the long table was the disciplinary board, their faces stern, with Gerald Ashworth occupying the center seat with the smug look of a man who believed victory was already in his hands, while Tom Regan sat tucked off to one side, his eyes avoiding hers, too afraid to look directly at her. The hearing began, and Ashworth immediately presented the edited video, playing it on the large screen before the entire board, while he launched into a long accusation against her for destroying property and abandoning her post in a reckless and undisciplined manner, his voice thick with false moral outrage. When the footage ended, several members of the board frowned at her with judgment in their eyes, and Ashworth leaned back with the faintest smile appearing at the corner of his mouth, certain that her fate had been sealed. But Dileia didn't tremble. She stood, her voice ringing out clearly and steadily in the silent room, saying that the video Mr. Ashworth had just shown them was only half the truth, a half that had been deliberately cut away to hide the most important thing, and that she was asking permission to show the board the whole story. She stepped forward, plugged the hard drive into the projector before anyone could stop her, and the original video began to play. The entire room fell silent as the unedited images appeared. The moments before she struck the car door, the instant the exposed current spat dangerous sparks across the wet road where the crowd was packed together. The moment she rushed in to cut the power and save the people around her from disaster, and the moment she saw a life fading behind the glass and made the decision any human being with a conscience would have had to make. Ashworth's face grew paler with every passing second of the footage. His smug smile vanished, and he began objecting in a panic, stammering that the video wasn't valid, that it had been obtained illegally, that it couldn't be accepted as evidence. But Dileia didn't give him the chance. She turned to the board, her voice growing harder and more forceful with each word, exposing that the deteriorating substation in that area had been the subject of complaints for months, while leadership had ignored them to save money, that it was that negligence that had turned the accident scene into a deadly trap with exposed electrical current, and that the editing of the footage hadn't been meant to protect the company, but to conceal certain people's responsibility, turning her into a scapegoat, so no one would question the carelessness that had been allowed to continue for far too long. She asked Ashworth directly to his face who had access to the camera system, who had ordered the footage edited, and why an act of saving a human life had been twisted into a crime with such deliberate intent. Ashworth shot to his feet, his face flushing red and then draining white, his mouth opening, but no words coming out, sweat beading across his forehead, and his panic, now exposed before the entire board, spoke more loudly than any accusation could have. The board members turned toward one another and began whispering, the atmosphere in the room shifting completely. And for the first time since she had stepped into that room, Dileia felt the scales of justice tipping toward her side. At that exact moment of unbearable tension, while Ashworth was still stammering and trying desperately to defend himself, the large door of the conference room suddenly opened, and a strange silence immediately fell as every eye turned toward the man who had just entered with a calm stride and an authority radiating from him that made the whole room seem to hold its breath. Roderick Vance had arrived, and his presence alone was enough to make Ashworth's face change from panic to true terror. As if he had just seen the worst nightmare of his life step across the threshold, Rodri stepped into the center of the room with the unhurried ease of a man who knew perfectly well that every eye and every measure of power in that space now belonged to him, and he didn't need to raise his voice, because his silence alone was enough to make the entire board lean in and wait. He placed a thick file on the table, opened it in front of the stunned board members, and began speaking in a voice that was calm but sharp as a blade, saying he was here as the representative of the family of the woman Miss Marsh had saved, and that he had brought with him certain truths Mr. Ashworth would probably never want dragged into the light. He slowly turned page after page, and each one was another cut into Gerald Ashworth's respectable mask. He revealed that for years Ashworth had turned maintenance cost-cutting into a system in order to make the numbers on his reports look better, ignoring repeated warnings about deteriorating substations and aging power lines, placing the lives of countless workers and ordinary citizens in danger simply so he could climb higher on the ladder of prestige. He presented emails, internal records, and statements from employees who had once been pressured and forced into silence, painting a naked portrait of a man willing to trample the weakest people beneath him just to protect his own chair. Then his voice dropped even lower, and he delivered the final blow, revealing that the distortion of the video hadn't merely been meant to conceal negligence, but that Ashworth also had shady financial ties to outside forces, people who had backed him and pressured him to crush every investigation connected to Margaret's accident, and that the money he had taken to stay silent had now become the noose around his own neck. The whole room went dead still, and Ashworth stood there, his entire body shaking, his face drained of every drop of blood, his mouth moving but unable to produce a single word of defense, because Rodri had coldly sealed every escape route one by one. Rodri didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He only turned and looked straight into Ashworth's eyes, saying that from this moment on, every document he had just presented was already in the hands of the board of directors, the media, and the proper authorities, and that the empire of reputation Ashworth had built on lies and cruelty would collapse before sunset. That was the punishment of a man who didn't need fists, a cold and precise strike aimed directly at the only things men like Ashworth truly valued: honor, status, and power. And when all of those things were stripped away in an instant, he had nothing left but naked humiliation before everyone who had once feared him. The disciplinary board immediately announced that all accusations against Dileia were dismissed and that Ashworth would be suspended pending a full investigation. And when 2 security officers stepped in to escort him out of the room, Gerald Ashworth, the man who only moments earlier had been sitting in the highest seat with a smug smile on his face, now shuffled away like a ruined shadow, his life's career turning to ash in just a few short minutes. Dileia stood motionless in the middle of the room, her chest rising and falling with emotion, both relieved that the truth had finally come to light and shaken by the way Roderick Vance could decide a person's fate with nothing more than a few sheets of paper and a voice so calm it was almost chilling. And for the first time, she truly understood the scale of the world she had accidentally stepped into. That night, after the chaos of the hearing had settled, and Dileia had returned to her daughter in a fragile, temporary peace, Rodri sat alone in the dark room high above the city, sipping his first glass of liquor in days. But his mind wasn't at ease, because he knew bringing Ashworth down had only cut away a rotten branch, while the poisoned root buried deep inside his own house still hadn't been torn out. Over the past several days, his most trusted man had quietly followed every thin thread, comparing every schedule, every phone call, every unusual transfer of money, and in the end, every trace led back to one person, a man who had stood inside the Vance family's inner circle for many years, a man Rodri had once trusted. When that name was confirmed, Rodri didn't rage. He only sat in silence for a long time. And in that moment, a flicker of pain passed through his usually cold eyes. The pain of a man realizing that the bitterest betrayals always come from hands we once held tightly. He summoned that man to an empty warehouse by the docks at midnight, where there was only Rodri, his trusted man, and a few silent figures standing guard in the dark corners. The traitor walked in with false confidence, still believing he hadn't been exposed. But the moment he saw Roderick's eyes, he understood that the game was over. Rodri didn't hurry. He slowly placed each piece of evidence on the old wooden table in the center of the warehouse. Bank statements, recordings, hidden photographs of secret meetings, each item set down like another brick, sealing off the last escape route of the man before him. In a low, even voice that was almost frightening, he asked whether the man knew the price of betraying someone who had once taken him in, whether he knew that Margaret had nearly paid with her life for the small profit he had stuffed into his own pocket. The traitor trembled and collapsed to his knees, stammering pleas, blaming circumstance, debts, and pressure from Silas Crowe. But every excuse only made the air inside the warehouse feel heavier. Rodri never laid a hand on him. He didn't need to. His real power lay in a kind of calm that could crush a man's spirit without a single blow. He only bent down, looked straight into the tear-filled eyes of the man who had betrayed him, and said softly that from this moment on, his name would be erased from every door that had once opened for him, that everything he had ever had, protection, position, safety, all of it, would vanish as if it had never existed, and that he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had sold his own loyalty for nothing and no longer had a single place in this city to hide. It was a sentence heavier than any physical punishment, an exile from the world he had once belonged to, and when Rodri's men silently escorted him out of the warehouse to deliver him to the consequences he had brought upon himself, the traitor no longer dared to lift his head. Roderick remained alone in the darkness, listening to the soft crash of waves beyond the docks, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to release a long, weary breath. He thought of Margaret slowly recovering in her hospital bed, thought of the courageous woman who had unknowingly pulled her whole life into the heart of this storm, and a strange feeling he hadn't known in a long time stirred quietly inside his chest. He knew the war still wasn't over, that the true mastermind, Silas Crowe, was still out there. But tonight, he had cleared the venomous snake from his own house, and he told himself he would never again allow anyone he cared about to face danger because of him. Silas Crowe wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat in silence, and when he learned that his network inside the Vance family had been exposed, he understood that he was slowly losing control. So he decided to make one final reckless gamble, aiming straight at the link he believed was the weakest and also the reason all his plans had fallen apart. And that link was Dileia. One evening, just after she left the boarding house to go to her extra night shift, Crowe's men followed her, forcing her old car onto an empty road leading toward the abandoned warehouses near the docks, where the sparse streetlights weren't bright enough to reveal the figures closing in around her. But what Crowe didn't know was that Roderick had already sensed this desperate move before it happened, and the men he had assigned to protect Dileia had never taken their eyes off her for even 1 second. The moment her car was forced to stop, and the strangers rushed out, a row of blinding headlights suddenly flared to life, tearing through the night, and Roderick's convoy swept in like a storm, cutting off every escape route Crowe's men had. Roderick stepped out of the car with a deadly calm in the middle of the chaos, and in an instant, his men surged forward and overpowered them. A fierce struggle broke out in the darkness around the warehouse. Sharp blows, shouted commands, bodies rushing into one another. But everything unfolded with a cold discipline that showed Rodri's side had complete control. Dileia crouched behind her car, her heart pounding, but she didn't collapse into helpless panic. With the quick instincts of an electrician used to facing danger, she managed to locate an outdoor breaker box nearby and safely tripped the main switch, plunging the entire area into darkness at exactly the right moment, creating a flash of confusion that left Crowe's men disoriented and made it easier for Rodri's people to subdue them. Amid that chaos, Silas Crowe, A man used to pulling strings from the shadows and never having to face consequences himself, tried to slip away into the dark. But Rodri stopped him. The two men stood facing each other in the blackened warehouse. Two underworld powers who had avoided a direct collision for years, now finally face to face. Crow growled threats, still trying to act as though he had control. But Rodri only looked at him with a gaze so flat and still. It was almost chilling, and said that Crow had made the greatest mistake of his life when he dared touch the people under Roderick's protection, that the day he ordered harm to an innocent elderly woman was the day he signed his own sentence. Crow lunged forward in desperation, but Rodri had already read every movement. He dodged cleanly, then locked him down with a swift, controlled hold that left him completely helpless, pinning him to the cold warehouse floor while his men quickly closed in around them. All of Crow's resistance vanished, and for the first time in his life, the man who had always spread fear in others was forced to taste that fear himself, terror showing plainly in his eyes, as he realized that the empire and power he had spent so long building had collapsed in a single night. Rodri didn't go too far, because he understood that forcing a man like Crow to live and watch everything he had built be stripped away would be a heavier punishment than anything else, and he coldly ordered that Crow and all the evidence be handed over to the hands that would make him pay according to the law. When everything was settled and his men had completely subdued the attackers, Rodri turned back to find Dileia and saw her standing there in the wreckage, trembling but still unbroken, her eyes holding a mixture of the fear she had just survived and a gratitude she couldn't put into words. And in the moment their gazes met, something invisible between two wounded people quietly changed forever. After that fateful night, Rodri took Dileia to a small, quiet cafe that was still open late, where warm light fell across the old wooden walls, and for the first time since they had known each other, the two of them sat across from one another, not as a powerful crime lord and a woman trapped in the storm around him, but as two ordinary people carrying their own private wounds. Dileia was still trembling from everything she had just been through, and she asked him in a voice both curious and cautious why he was willing to turn the whole city upside down, willing to face the most dangerous men, all for one old woman and a stranger like her. Rodri remained silent for a long time, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, his eyes distant as if he were reaching back toward some place in the past. Then he slowly began to speak, and his usually cold voice now carried a softness that very few people had ever been allowed to hear. He told her that he had lost both his father and mother when he was still a boy, that the world back then had become nothing to him but a pitch-black place with no way out, and that there had been a time when he thought he would be swallowed whole by resentment and despair. It was Margaret, the grandmother, who had opened her arms and taken him in when there was no one else left, who had pulled him back from that edge, who had taught him that even in the cruelest world, kindness still existed, and who had never let go of him even after he had become the man he was today. He said she was the only thread connecting him to the human part still left inside him, the only reason his hardened heart still knew how to tremble, and that on the day he heard she was lying between life and death, he had felt as though he himself were being dragged back into that old darkness, back into the fear of losing someone he loved, a fear he had believed he had buried long ago. Then he lifted his eyes and looked straight into Dileia's, saying that when he learned the person who had pulled his grandmother's life back from the hands of death wasn't one of the men he paid to protect her, but a strange woman who owed his family nothing, a woman who had rushed into danger simply because she couldn't stand by and watch someone die. He had felt something he didn't have the words to name, a deep gratitude mixed with a painful sense of guilt. Dileia listened, and her own eyes grew blurred, because his story touched the very grief she had carried for so long, and she softly admitted that she understood what it felt like to lose the person she loved most, what it felt like to force herself to keep walking after the whole world had collapsed, because she too had lost her husband in a tragedy that should have been prevented. Two people, a powerful crime lord who seemed impossible to shake, and a poor widow carrying an entire family on her shoulders, sat there beneath the warm yellow light, and suddenly realized that no matter how different their origins and fates might be, they were both lives that had once been broken by the world, and then pieced back together by their own hands. They both understood the price of loss, and the strength it took to keep living. In that quiet moment, there was no confession of love, no eager gesture, only a deep understanding beginning to grow between two wounded souls, a fragile but honest connection, and for the first time in a very long time, both Roderick and Dileia felt they were no longer alone in the fight against their own ghosts. A few weeks later, when the waves from the incident had gradually settled, and Brightline Power was sinking into crisis after Ashworth's downfall and the exposure of countless violations, Rodri invited Dileia to his office, but not to hand her a check or some glittering promise she had been guarding herself against. Instead, he placed a file in front of her and told her in a calm voice that he had bought the entire rotten power company, the very company that had once tried to crush her, and that he intended to restructure it from the roots, sweeping away the culture that treated human life as something lesser than profit. Dileia stared at him in stunned silence, not yet fully understanding what those words meant. And then Rodri said the thing that made her heart seem to stop, that he wanted her to take the position of safety supervisor for the entire system, that he wanted the very woman the system had once trampled to now be the one who stood up to protect every other worker, the person with full authority to inspect, suspend, and demand repairs on anything that threatened the lives of laborers. He said he hadn't chosen her out of pity, but because he had never seen anyone with courage and conscience like hers, and that a woman willing to risk her entire career to save a stranger's life was the only person he trusted to carry such a responsibility. Dileia sat there in silence, and in that moment, a choked wave of emotion rose inside her chest, because she understood this wasn't only a job or a chance to change her life, it was a kind of healing she had never dared to dream of. For the past 2 years, she had lived with a wound that throbbed quietly and never closed. The pain of losing her husband because of the negligence of people who placed money above human life. And now life was giving her the chance to turn that very tragedy into strength, to keep another wife from receiving the devastating news she had once been forced to bear, to protect workers like the man she had loved from that cruel fate. Tears rolled down her face. But they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release, as if the circle of grief that had followed her for so long had finally found a way to close with meaning and hope. Still, her natural pride wouldn't allow her to accept easily, and Dileia lifted her eyes to look straight into Rodri, and said she would take the position, but under her own conditions. She said she wanted to work through her own ability, not under the shadow of his power, that every decision involving safety had to be respected absolutely and never influenced by any calculation of profit, and that she would leave immediately if she ever realized this job was only a form of charity or a thread meant to tie her to his world. Rodri looked at her, and across his usually cold face appeared the faint trace of a rare smile filled with respect, because that very toughness and unbreakable self-respect in her were the reasons he was certain he hadn't chosen the wrong person. He nodded and agreed to all of her conditions without the slightest hesitation, then said that was exactly why he needed her, because a system was only truly safe when the person leading it was someone who would never bow to pressure. When Dileia walked out of that building with the file in her hands and a completely new future opening before her, she felt for the first time in so many years that the weight on her shoulders was no longer despair, but had become a mission, a road she would walk with all the pride and courage she had always carried within her. A few months later, beneath the clear blue sky of an early summer day, the substation that had once stood as a symbol of negligence and death had now been completely repaired, wearing a new look that was clean, solid, and safe. And around it, people held a small, warm celebration for the workers and their families. Cheerful voices and laughter rang throughout the area. Long tables were filled with food. Small flags fluttered in the wind. And in the middle of that joy-filled scene, Dileia stood there in her brand-new safety supervisor uniform, her face glowing with a happiness she hadn't been able to fully feel in far too long. She had just been talking with a group of workers about the new safety procedures when a tiny body came rushing toward her with a clear, bright call, and Posey threw herself into her mother's arms, her chubby cheeks flushed from running and playing, a wildflower in her hand that she had just picked. Dileia lifted her daughter into her arms and spun once amid the little girl's giggles. And in that moment, every burden, every sorrow she had ever endured seemed to dissolve, leaving only the overflowing love between mother and child. Posey knew nothing at all about the dark world she and her mother had passed through. She only knew that her mother was happier now, that she smiled more often, and that dinner at home no longer carried the shadow of worry the way it once had. Just then, a luxurious car stopped in the distance, and Margaret stepped out, her steps steady again after the long days of recovery. She slowly walked toward Dileia, and when the two women stood face to face, a quiet wave of emotion rose between them, because this was the first time they had truly met again since the fateful day that had tied their destinies together. Margaret took Dileia's hands in hers, the very hands that had once fought death itself to pull her back, and said in a choked voice that she had waited a long time to thank, With her own words, the brave woman who had given her the chance to keep living, the chance to see beautiful days like this one. The two women embraced, a hug filled with understanding and gratitude that needed no words, and Margaret softly whispered that she hadn't been wrong about her, that the kindness she had believed in all her life truly still existed, alive and warm, right there in the woman standing before her. From a distance, leaning against his car, Rodri quietly watched the scene, not stepping forward, not breaking the sacred moment between the women, only standing there with the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth and a rare gentleness in his eyes, like a silent gatekeeper guarding the peace he had helped bring back. Dileia Marsh's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's true worth never lies in appearance, status, or the money in their pocket, but in the courage to do what's right, and in the kindness that knows how to place human life above everything else. And that the dignity of a good heart is something no force can ever buy or break, no matter how cruel the circumstances may be. Sometimes in the darkest hours of life, one small act of kindness can light a flame that changes the fate of many people. If Dileia's story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you're still listening. Dileia never ran toward that wreck for money, power, or recognition. She ran because someone needed help, and in that moment, kindness was stronger than fear. That single choice changed more than one life. It reminded an entire underworld that the people with the least to give are sometimes the ones who give the most. If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness still matters. Subscribe for more emotional stories about courage, sacrifice, and ordinary people whose choices change everything. Thank you for staying until the end. Tell us in the comments what part of Dileia's story touched you the most. We'll see you in the next story.